August the 13th. And if it's a Tuesday morning in hurricane season, that means it's time to track the tropics from Central Florida. I'm West 2 meteorologist Eric Burris.
And from Savannah, Georgia, I'm WJCL 22, Chief Meteorologist Jeremy Nelson. Welcome in.
Good morning. All right, so we've got two things to discuss today, Jeremy. Of course, we've got what's going on now, watching Tropical Storm Ernesto, and then it's the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Charley making landfall on Southwest Florida. So there's a lot to discuss this morning.
Yeah, and then even once we get past Ernesto, people are already asking me, hey, what's the rest of the month look like? And of course, we kind of put our map out for the season back on March the 1st. So we can talk about
Yeah.
that. But you're going to get us started with Ernesto. And that's
Yeah.
sort of in an area right now where we would just look at it on paper and be like, ooh, this is something we really need to watch.
Yeah.
But maybe not for us here in the States.
Yeah, thankfully the atmosphere is such that this storm should not at least be an immediate problem for the United States. But just looking at the tropical satellite imagery, it's really starting to get that look, starting to get better organized, some outflow, some decent bubbling of convection. The hurricane hunters have been in there this morning, and as of the 8 a.m. intermediate advisory, winds are up from 40 to 45 miles an hour. It's slowing its forward motion down, which is a good indicator of doing some bit of strengthening. Visible satellite presentation still looking very, very good. Take a look at the data from the hurricane hunters this morning. And I want to point out that blue line there on the graph, that's the SFMR winds. It's a tool that they use to be able to scan and notice that they were finding in some of those core punches winds right up to hurricane status. Do they upgrade it at 11 o'clock? More than likely not, but they'll probably, I would suspect that we're going to see a bump in the winds from 45 to 60, even 65 or 70 miles per hour. Jeremy, thoughts?
Yeah, and I think maybe the National Hurricane Center does not have this yet, but I still think there's a possibility once it makes that turn north, there could even be bordering on a major hurricane.
Yeah.
Um, so I think things really get ramped up when it makes that turn to the north, but it is starting to organize quickly here. We know the water's warm there. And of course, we'll be watching Puerto Rico, possibly for more rain versus wind, but we'll see.
Yeah. So here's the forecast from the National Hurricane Center, and it's already outplaying its forecast run. It was supposed to get as strong as it was at 8 a.m. by this afternoon. Data is indicating that it's already done that. So we are clearly intensifying. One thing that I noted this morning, Jeremy, in looking at the data off of the ship's intensity model, is
Hmm.
that the ship's model is an intensity model, giving us an idea of how strong things could get. But it also gives, and this is one of those kind of underutilized parameters, it also gives data on how likely rapid intensification is. And within the next 24 hours' time, there is a 55% likelihood for rapid intensification, according to the ship's model, which is 5 times more than climatologically average. So, to that point, I think that that's a pretty good indicator that this forecast of tropical storm until Thursday morning is certainly not set in stone.
Yeah, and we'll see that intensity probably just from the satellite representation of it start to ramp up today. And as you mentioned, rapid intensification. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to see it go from a tropical storm to a major hurricane
Right,
maybe within a day,
right.
but certainly we could see it go from 50-mile-per-hour winds closer to 90 or maybe even 100 in a pretty short amount of time. There'll be some minimal land interaction coming up. But then once it's into the Southwest Atlantic, that's just warm water out there.
Well, and just in discussing rapid intensification, look at the Hurricane Hunter data here, okay? So this morning's 5 a.m. advisory had winds of 40 miles an hour. Hurricane Hunters found in core punches winds right up to about category 1 intensity. So to that point, we have perhaps already started a rapid intensification cycle?
Yeah, and then when I know you always have the flight data, did they say the next time they're going to go sample that storm this afternoon or evening, maybe?
Yeah, it would be this afternoon. It would be this afternoon.
Okay. So, and again, for anyone that doesn't follow us or new, they also then ingest all that data gets put into future computer model
Yeah,
runs. So we
yeah.
start to get a better idea. And then those models sometimes start to catch up a little bit in terms of how quickly this may
Yep.
organize or develop.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, in terms of advisories, let's just take a look. Okay. Tropical storm warnings are in effect through many of the northern Caribbean islands, including the Virgin Islands, including Puerto Rico. So, for those of us with friends and family that live down there in the islands, this afternoon into tonight, things are just going to start to get kind of crummier and crummier. Let me just dial this in here real fast. There's the radar imagery. We have, thankfully, really good radar coverage down in this section of the Caribbean. So let's zoom in here, and you can kind of see it's going to take it a couple seconds because I zoomed in to go buffer the data, but you can clearly see that squally weather working up towards St. Martin, St. Croix. So at this point in time, just a few of those outermost bands are starting to work into Puerto Rico, but over the next few hours' time, we'll start to see more of that kind of crummier weather moving that direction.
Yeah, and on those outer bands, probably starting to get some wind gusts, potentially 35, 40 miles per hour that will work in. We saw that with Debbie when that was down in your area
Yeah.
or in the eastern Gulf. We were already starting to get some outer bands that came through that had some just kind of quick bursts of wind with those. So that's very likely out ahead of Ernesto, some of the islands, what they'll experience as well.
Right. So we showed you the official forecast from the Hurricane Center. Let me load up the computer forecast models, okay? This is the model suite, fairly tight in agreement, keeping the core of the storm. What we've done is we've put the models inside the tropical cone there, okay? And so I think that there's a really good forecast from the National Hurricane Center. All of the models kind of in the center of that forecast cone, okay? Uh, the only problem down the road here is the island, and this is one of those enigmas to me, Jeremy. How is it that you're a tiny speck in the middle of the Atlantic and seemingly tropical systems just love finding you?
Yeah, you're on that highway where they sort of like to roam out there in the Atlantic. But one thing I've noticed is with how small Bermuda is, it's pretty tough to get a direct hit on
Yep.
that. I mean, some right now, obviously, we're seeing some models brush by it or get very close to it. We'll see how this ends up trending, but it's always like at some point they're in that 3 to 5 day cone. It looks like they're going to get hit, and then the storm kind of goes around it in one direction or another. But certainly, I guess if there's a storm that is bearing down, that'd be a kind of a lonely place to be. Not too many places to hide.
Yeah, and so to that point, if we have friends or family that are there, this weekend is probably going to be rough, even if it's just rough surf and a rip currents and some squally weather. But hopefully not a direct hit. I mean, if anything, let's get it just to the east of the island of Bermuda. But in the meantime, down here in the Caribbean, you've got basically today, tonight through tomorrow morning for the Virgin Islands into Puerto Rico for that squally weather. And again, tropical storm warnings are posted, meaning that tropical storm conditions are expected within the next 36 hours time. Obviously, it's tonight into tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and then even farther down the road, I think the models maybe in the last day or so trended a little closer to the Canadian Maritimes, some
Yeah,
of the areas up in there.
yeah.
So they'll have to watch it as well.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so that's kind of where we're at for Ernesto right now. Thankfully, no threats to your area, Jeremy. No threats to my area, but certainly things that we're going to have to watch as this develops, just for our friends or our family that live in some of these other spots. So let's pause, I suppose, at the moment and take any kind of questions that anybody may have regarding Ernesto, and then we can move on, look at some model data for Ernesto, the rest of the tropics right now. And then we've got, of course, the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Charley making landfall in Southwest Florida, moving through my area. Certainly a good discussion. And Jeremy, we had a really good discussion on my coffee talk this morning. Look forward to bringing you into that as well here.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. So let's take a look at if you have some of the numbers up, we can give people an update. I know last week a lot of our time was sort of consumed by Debbie. Now
Yeah.
we have Ernesto. So this is the fifth named storm. So we're starting to see a few more named storms now. We have five. We're above the average, which is roughly around 3.5 at this
Yep.
point. Last year we also had five. Last year we ended up with, I believe it was like 20 named storms. We had an unnamed storm that was also part of that mix from January.
Right.
So we had the January storm plus 19 that gave us 20 last year. So we're still running above average, although some people are like, wow, this has been a quiet season. I can promise you one thing in my area with Debbie impacting us, it's been nothing. No one's going to say this is a quiet season here
Yeah.
because we had and are still dealing with some river flooding and some neighborhoods that were hit really hard. The water finally starting to go down in the last 24 hours. But there's a whole lot of cleanup because some houses had water go right in them.
Yeah, that we knew that it was going to be a big flood threat for your
Hmm.
area. Unfortunately, that played out. Also, in terms of just days tracking systems, we have had 17 and a half days with a named storm in the basin. The 30-year average is 11 and a half. So we're well above the kind of days covering storms, but about 2 days short of where we were last year. And this is the most direct metric that we can use in tracking systems, right? It's the ACE, the accumulated cyclonic energy, right now sitting at 41.1 ACE points. Certainly Beryl and its strength really upped that number. The 30-year average, 13.7, last year was 15.6. So certainly when we talk about tropical systems and tropical seasons, we've developed many more ACE points than recent years. As a matter of fact, so what we're sitting at 41.1. Let me just quickly run the numbers. Um, the last time we had more than 40 ace points, Jeremy, through
Okay,
today, you ready for this?
I'm waiting.
1980.
Wow.
So that's an interesting metric there.
Yeah, because as we've mentioned, we've had much busier seasons to this point in terms of name storms, but we had a Category 5 hurricane,
Right.
and that was a long-lasting system. Really racked up the ACE. We
Yep.
had Debbie, that was a hurricane, maybe not that long as a hurricane, but nonetheless, that added some. And
Right.
then now Ernesto is probably going to make that number go up a decent amount because that will be a hurricane for several days out in the Atlantic.
And, the potential, I wouldn't write off its potential of becoming a major hurricane. I just wouldn't.
Hmm.
It seems like it's intensifying quicker and earlier, right, than
Right.
initial thoughts. So why wouldn't it continue on, especially with the ship's model's rapid intensification parameter being in the 55 percentile? This morning, I think it was at 46%. So that thought process is starting to increase as we're watching the satellite trends for sure.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any type of model data you want to take a look
Oh,
at
yeah.
here? And then
Oh,
we can
yeah.
probably add some thoughts on something the models maybe have only picked up in a couple runs,
Yeah.
but maybe a little time frame we'll just be kind of keeping an eye on as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, 100%. All right, so let's look at some raw model data here together. This is the American GFS model, all right, and there it goes, clearly showing Ernesto recurving, and at least the GFS is going to bring it awful close to Bermuda, but it should stay just off to the east, which if it's going to bypass the island, let it be to the east where they're kind of on the subsidence side of the storm system. But at that time period, and I started to notice this, all right, so right about, we'll say even like tomorrow, notice the model trying to throw some lowered pressure, almost like a tail there, Jeremy, extending back into the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos. It's not a significant indicator, but there's at least some sort of a hint at something, perhaps.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it. And I did get a question. I was trying to scan the questions
Yeah.
there. Lily was asking if it will hit Florida. And as you're showing right there, this stays far to the east. So Ernesto, not a threat to Florida, but we often say this sort of the indirect impacts. Your coast will feel it. Mine will feel it, some larger swells. And then we'll just have to watch maybe a current risk this weekend or a couple days beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if it can drag in some drier air, I don't think either of us are going to complain about. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, we need the rain certainly, but your area a lot less than my area at this point,
Right.
right? So
We're good on rain for a while.
yeah, yeah, I would suspect so. All right, so let's take a look and see. This is just continuing to run the GFS. It moves out, and kind of a sea of high pressure moves in, keeping the weather beautiful. And while there are a few hints, like right in here, you can see out near the Windward Islands, bottom right corner of your screen there, there's a hint at some that white shade. So lowered pressure in a sea of high pressure, but nothing significant. And then we re-loop it back around. So
And what
GF
model was that one?
that's the GFS. So I'll switch over to
Okay.
the Euro and just kind of see here. Same idea. There goes there goes Ernesto. Thankfully, no big, no big indicators there. Ernesto goes by. Again, there's this little tail of low pressure, just sloppy low pressure into this weekend. No indication here of anything significant, but like late this week into this weekend, there's at least these little hints of lowered pressure just kind of being left over the southeastern United States. Could it mean some higher rain chances for my area, even for your area, Jeremy? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But then afterward, not really much else to track there.
And then where did the model end? What was the date there?
This
The
is the
final one?
this is the 22nd of August. So notice around Puerto
Okay.
Rico, unorganized, but some broad lowered pressure. Nothing significant there.
Right. So if you look at the whole window here, we had around somewhere like the 18th to 26th, and
Yeah.
this is one of the more complex parts of the pattern where there's like two or three different lows. We've in the write up, at least the one I did, I'm sure Eric's is very similar. So we put our numbers together, we put our dates together, the time frames, our hot spots, all the ingredients, and then we kind of do our own write ups, which are very similar. But we were talking about watch the Southwest Atlantic, and then also within this, maybe the eastern part of the Gulf. So a couple of the longer range model runs have tried to hint at maybe weak low pressure in the Gulf around like the 26th,
Yeah.
27th in there. So that's in our that was in our time window as well. So that's something we'll just keep an eye on. But we think the chances are better in that area of something that would be more homegrown
Right.
versus coming all the way across the Atlantic and impacting us. So that's just something we'll watch. And as you said, lowering of pressures. We'll see what happens, but again, just something to monitor, and we'll be talking about it next week as well.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of I'm looking around at the ensembles right now, Jeremy, and it's one of those cases, right, where it's like I'm looking at, there's nothing significant there indicated,
Right.
but there's some hints out in the Gulf of some lowered pressure. That's the GFS. Let me look over at the European ensemble. Let me just run this and
And
I'm just
not many model runs have had anything,
right.
but it is just hey, we know that part of the pattern. There were some multiple lows around. Let's just keep an eye on it
Yeah.
because, and like you said, maybe it's just an increase in rain chances, something like that. But it would be something that would potentially be more like Gulf, Florida, Southwest Atlantic,
Yeah,
Bahamas type
yeah,
of area.
yeah. So we'll watch it. We'll see how it goes. But at least for now, the good news is that it's not looking like it's going to be a major thing at this point in time. The thing that we're really watching is Tropical Storm Ernesto seemingly getting its act together, and it'll be interesting to see what the Hurricane Center comes up with for their 11 o'clock or for their 11 o'clock advisory. I suspect it will be getting to strong tropical storm strength.
Yeah, I think so. So we'll see those winds start to ramp up quite a bit on that.
Yeah,
So
a couple good
right
questions,
before
by the
I
way.
think you're wanting to talk about Charlie. One thing here, as I look at that like month-long
Yep.
forecast, it is also fitting as we go into September, especially the back half of September is starting to give a pretty active look on a couple of the long-range things I'm looking at. And again, that's also sort of recycling those time windows that Debbie part of the pattern would cycle back. Not saying it would be the exact same thing, but it would be some of those same areas that we'd really want to watch.
Yeah.
And then that would be in the back half of September, leading us into early October. So even though maybe we haven't had a whole ton of names so far, we are above average, but maybe below some people's expectations. I would say we'll judge the season when it's over,
Yep.
but it does look like we'll get through this month and then uh, really starting to see a couple things pointing to later September.
Well, and to that point too, it's important to reiterate we will judge the season when it's over. It's too early to have any discussion of this is a slow season, this is an active season. The way I think that we look at our forecasting when we put out our preseason forecast is we issue it. And then it's done. We're not
Mhm.
going to sit here and harp on where should we be versus where we are. The forecast is done. Let's now get into the tracking part of the season. And
Right.
then when it's done, we can look back and say, where could we improve? Where did we do well? Where did we not do well? So I think that that's an important aspect to remember as well.
Right.
Okay. All right. A couple of good questions here. Adam is asking between drop zones, how is wind speed calculated from the recon planes? When nerding out and tracking the recon flights, I'm always curious how they estimate surface winds. So there are different tools on the different aircraft. The SFM are the stepped frequency micro radiometer thing. I can't think of the exact name of it. It's a big, we call it the SFMR, and it basically uses a microwave beam that shoots out from the aircraft and it measures the sea spray among other things on the ocean surface. And based on calculations, you can see the winds based on sea spray. Now that there are some contamination elements that you have to look for on that, but that's one of the ways that we're able to do it. So I think when that came out, that was one of those let it blow your mind a little bit factors. Like we're looking at sea spray based on wind speeds. That's wild.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. There's so many different things that when they go out into these storms, the data we can gather, and it just in turn helps us in the end get a better forecast.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Speaking of better forecasts, 20 years ago today, there was a forecast that kind of tweaked around just a little bit. It was Hurricane Charley. Jeremy, I know that you weren't in the southeastern United States at the time, but do you have memories of Charley?
I do, and my memory is okay. So that had to be probably was that like on a Thursday or
It was a
Friday?
Friday night.
Okay, so a Friday. Yes, I remember it. At that time, I was working in Madison, Wisconsin, and as a meteorologist there.
Hmm.
And I went to the Cubs game that day down in Chicago. And here's why I remember Charlie because I was in a restaurant before the game,
Yeah.
and they had the TVs on WGN, and Tom Skilling was on,
Yep. Yep.
and he was showing track of Charlie and everything. And I even way back then, and obviously my focus for my viewers not on tropics
Yeah.
necessarily, but just as a meteorologist interested in it, I was like, wow, that kind of looks like it's making a little bit of a right turn there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know you were in the depths of it.
Yeah, yeah, I was right here in Central Florida tracking it. I've got a picture because, but this was
There it
yeah.
is.
Look at those. I had blonde highlights and sideburns, but yeah, this was me running radar here in Central Florida, as the center of that circulation moved right up Interstate 4, and this was a notable system because I grew up here in Central Florida, right? I was born in '84. Don't judge me. So I was 20 years old when the storm was making landfall. And up to that point, it was just this expectation of hurricanes don't hit Orlando, right? And fast forward to 2004, a hurricane very much hit Orlando. The winds brought down trees because the infrastructure had not been hit. Think about this, Jeremy. Okay, the last time a hurricane like this hit Central Florida was before Disney showed up. Like calculate that in your brain. Seriously, think about that for a second.
That's a
Before
long
Disney,
time.
it was 44 years prior. Hurricane Donna in 1960 was the last storm that really moved into Central Florida. So it made landfall in Southwest Florida as a Category 4, made that hard right-hand turn because this cold front was shifting it around. And another thing, and we discussed this a lot on my coffee talk this morning, that is kind of fascinating. Now, the National Hurricane Center works in conjunction with local forecast offices. So there are inland watches and warnings, okay? There are extreme wind warnings. But back in 2004, there were no inland watches and warnings for hurricanes, and there were no extreme wind warnings. So the National Weather Service office here in Central Florida, the only way that they could trigger the emergency alert system, they issued a big old tornado warning.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and as a matter of fact, I can pull up the image of it because Matt, one of our viewers this morning on Coffee Talk, I mentioned this, Jeremy, and Matt went into the Internet Archives and did whatever the kids do these days, and he was able to find it, and it's kind of fascinating. I mean, it's super fascinating that you could.
Right.
But so that's the tornado warning from 20 years ago until so read this. The National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for the destructive winds over 100 miles an hour and tornadoes in the eye wall and inner rain bands of Hurricane Charley, right? Because at that time, so after this, then the National Weather Service went back and said, we've got to do something. Because the Weather Service office
Right.
had no way to fire all the warnings out there, to get the weather radios going, to tell residents like, now you're in it, guys. This is about to get bad. And so, I often say Charlie was when we realized inland metropolitan areas were a little more at risk than maybe we had thought, right? And so
Yeah.
this was my first hurricane in hurricane coverage in the television business. I'd worked for 2 years in Central Florida without it at that point. But I just think that it's one of those fascinating moments in time.
Oh, I think so for sure. And then as you look at that path there, it ended up making another landfall near Myrtle Beach
Hmm.
down the road. I was looking at previous forecasts for it before it made landfall, and obviously it had that track a little bit more north northeast, and it had the system moving right on top of Savannah in some previous forecasts, and then it made that turn, so it stayed
Yeah.
offshore. And
Yeah.
for us, not a whole lot of impacts, but then again, it ended up running up towards the Myrtle Beach area, so it
Yeah.
did make a second landfall. But really, it was all about Southwest Florida, your area. And then you saw something sort of similar with Ian recently.
Right.
So there again, you had all kinds of rain, you had wind, and that was right in Orlando. So you
Yeah.
have shown here, whether it's in 2004 or more recently with Ian, that you can get those direct hurricane impacts in your area.
With Ian, with Irma, right? I mean, like you could go down a list of storms, and I think that now my area certainly has realized that we are just at threat of it. But it's fascinating because at the time it was just the nomenclature, like, we're in Orlando. We just don't get hit. And it's like weather is always changing. You know, people in Tampa strongly believe they cannot get hit by a hurricane. And it's like, y'all have had some really good luck. But don't sit there and sleep on the fact that you're still right on the beautiful Gulf of Mexico and you get the wrong storm at the right time, and it happens.
Right. I mean, all of us at some point down the road will likely have, if you're along the coast,
Yeah,
probably from the Outer Banks all the way down to Brownsville. If you run this out 100, 200 plus years,
right.
all of us at some point are probably going to be within a small amount of miles of some sort of direct impact.
100%, 100%. So 20 years ago today, I'm having a special lunch today with the guy that I was tracking the storm with. We're just gonna sit back, relax, and be glad we're not tracking a hurricane in Central Florida today.
Yeah, and the storm we are tracking is going to stay far away from us, but we'll keep an eye on it for
Yeah.
anyone with interest down there around Puerto Rico.
Yep. Sounds good to me. All right. Anything else you have, my friend?
No, I think we're all good here. We're hoping all the water gets out of the neighborhoods in parts of my area. Still
Yeah.
dealing with that from Debbie. I know people here saw some of the initial tracks, and again, our jobs get made so much tougher by people that are a little too enthusiastic
Yeah.
about model data sometimes, and then they just want to put whatever they can do to get clicks. And we try to have to sort through the noise and the some of the hype and antics. But if people follow us here, we can guarantee you we'll give it our best effort every
Yeah.
Tuesday to let you know exactly what is going to happen.
So I just have to say there's a comment. So Matt, the guy that found that tornado warning, he just posted, Jeremy, I was at the Cubs game 2 versus the Dodgers that same day. How about that?
That is pretty crazy.
That's great. You're talking to
I
one
don't. I
game
mean,
20 years ago.
honestly, that's so long ago. I probably remember more that I actually saw Tom Skilling talking about Hurricane Charley than I do anything about that game. But yeah, it was a beautiful day in Chicago. I also think you would appreciate this. I think it was the same weekend that the air show was going on there.
Love it. Love well, and
So,
so for Wesh, it was imagine being in this moment, okay? You've got a hurricane that wasn't supposed to coming, and it was the opening ceremony of the Athens Olympics that night. Friday night, August the
oh,
13th. So you're an NBC station set to launch the Olympics. Openings, everybody loves the opening ceremony, and you've got a hurricane that's just all of a sudden coming.
mm-hmm. Wow.
Can you imagine that? Matt says Carlos Zambrano pitched, so he remembers the game. All right, that's all I've got.
Okay.
I've got another meeting in 2 minutes down the hall at the graphic
All
design
right.
hub. Thank you, my friend, for hanging out. Thank you all for hanging out. Glad that we don't have any threats in this moment, but certainly every Tuesday, Jeremy and I meet up, we chat, and give you every little bit of information we have so that you can feel comfortable and safe through hurricane season. So love that. All right, from Central Florida, I'm WESH 2 meteorologist Eric Burris.
And in Savannah, Georgia, I'm WJCL 22 Chief Meteorologist